The U.S. Forest Service logo here, because a lot of this work was associated with a couple different projects that were funded by the U.S. Forest Service, and they're often unrecognized for a lot of their work. And I know my client's boss often complains about that, so I just want to try to get that in there as much as I can. So, great. So I'll start off. Just give a quick agenda. I'm not going to talk about the definition of cultural and social services, but really what we found in the literature as far as how people talked about them, because it's really nuanced, and especially with regard to ecosystem services, you know, kind of these days, especially as ecosystem services has kind of risen up from the 90s period of time, that term ecosystem services, the cultural component has just been going everywhere, and I think it's narrowing down to some extent, but it's still all over the place. And so then we're going to talk about the subject of quantification and monetization. I'll talk a lot about just existing tools, methodologies that we use and are currently used, and we don't necessarily have the capacity to use ourselves, but other people out there use them. And finally, talking about case studies, again, those methods, sources, and techniques that are used in particular case studies, how they're integrated into projects, so more of a practical application, and how those actually influence policy in each of those specific cases. So I'll stop at a couple different points to make sure, and just kind of take a break and get some questions from you guys. But on the so cultural services, when we're looking into the literature, obviously we started with the MES, which you guys seem to be getting familiar with, and they do a pretty quick and dirty job as far as identifying cultural services. And they talk about a few categories. They say recreation, aesthetics, they say science and education, just cultural in general. I guess sometimes they had said subsistence was a word I come across in a couple papers. And so I think it's often in terms of the indigenous peoples and sort of the benefits people get often in a rural context. And then another term we often run into is social. So this we've come across in many different instances, many different tools, and this would be both in the rural and urban context. So social, again, would be talking about really the same things as cultural, like we found in MEA, but would also come up in context of the urban ecosystem services too, which was you get into a completely different spectrum of the benefits that people receive from nature in the urban context. And a couple other things we've heard too. Sometimes health was just kind of thrown into the cultural or social bubble. It's even actually implicitly some of the ecosystem services that we deal with that we wouldn't necessarily call cultural. It ends up in a service such as water quality or air purification, the benefits that people receive as the forest out here either absorbs a lot of the pollutants in the air, or a wetland provides filtration before stormwater goes out to a creek system. And then finally, the benefits people receive from just being within a community. And this is all related to an interaction in the natural realm. So forests, quick example, and many of you likely know this, forests have often come up in the context of providing benefits for people as gathering spaces, especially in low-income areas. And when you get down to the individual level, there's a spectrum of different benefits. And I'll actually end up talking about kind of the broader list here in a moment. Some things we're careful about when we talk about these things is identifying the services versus the benefits. It's like the provisioner versus the beneficiary. And so we want to be careful in this interpretation as when you get down to the specific measurement of these sorts of things, identifying what's providing the benefit versus who's receiving it allows you to kind of tease out a lot of the problems associated with measuring and eventually monetizing some of these services. And finally, urban versus rural. Again, when you get from the spectrum across, going from the urban to rural context, you get a lot of the same services, but everything starts to change. The way you measure them changes, and the way you identify them changes. So, and again, feel free at any time if you guys have questions, raise your hand, and I don't mind stopping and kind of bringing it full here. So ecosystem service impacts is interesting. There's the fact that you can measure them as kind of they are existing now is I would even say rather new, but often and historically these sorts of benefits are not realized until they're damaged, until there's been an impact to a community. And that's been unfortunately really the case when they're implemented into policy. And a good example everybody knows is the Cuyahoga River. This is that famous case. The Cuyahoga River, for those who don't know where it's located regionally, this is in northern Ohio. describe the river as not really flowing but oozing along. And this specific fire, I think in 67, was a particularly big one, but several had happened. You can actually see the infrastructure that exists along the riverside, was placed there because it had fires for like a couple of years. And finally got the attention of a national paper, which ended up taking this photograph and really spurring this, what ended up being a lot of the water and general environmental policy that was enacted in the late 60s. And so I often mention this because this was where environmental impact statements were born. They didn't talk about ecosystem services. That concept really wasn't developed, and at least or keyed, until what I would argue the late 90s. But they start talking about the impacts to the environmental realm when you start talking about the things that were lost, and we end up calling them services. And so then NEPA was born, EPA was born out of this, the same era, and environmental impact statements were born. And actually, not too much longer, social impact statements were born in the, kind of in the late 60s when some social components were included, but officially in the early 70s. And there's a famous oil spill case up in Alaska in the 1970s where an indigenous group was, affected, in a very poor manner. This isn't that case. This is actually a case in Intag, Ecuador. It's along the coast in the Ecuador community. And internationally, of course, the standards change when you start talking about how the impacts are recognized for environmental and social cases. But I thought this is a good. It just shows the nearby community and this recent oil spill that took place. So when you start talking about impacts, it's really when these environmental services and benefits become recognized. And it's not until a disaster happens. Oslo is a good example of when we start thinking about how we manage forests on a steep slope with certain soil types. Now FEMA is just beginning to recognize kind of and ways to manage forests, so we actually take that into consideration. There's only policy that's been enacted as of late to consider this sort of thing. We're working with FEMA currently to begin considering drought and wildfire threats as far as how they begin to mitigate against those natural disasters, and that's only really because of the latest big fires and this 4-year drought that we're experiencing in California. Once you start pushing the alarm button, that's really when this policy becomes implemented, unfortunately. So I like to introduce this concept because that's really how everything becomes born. And what we often try to do is recognize the benefits that currently exist so we can make an argument for them before they become damaged. So, just a couple examples, and you guys are pretty familiar with this, but as far as how some cultural services are identified, recreation is a pretty obvious one that shows up in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Indigenous groups and really the benefits they receive is a broader category, but I like to include this one, especially one where foraging exists, and one that's not incredibly well known, but a lucrative case is just the medicinal purposes. I mean, in the indigenous crowd, the benefits are really by community and are even in some cases protected information as far as geographically where some of these things exist. But in the Pacific Northwest, there was a yew tree that was for many, many years considered a trash tree. It wasn't very strong and durable, and it was actually pretty stunty and short. And it wasn't until they discovered Taxol, the specific tree, which is a drug used to treat breast cancer, and it wasn't until that was discovered to where this actually became a very valuable tree that's now protected wherever found, and is now a multi-billion-dollar industry. So, it's these services that exist that are relatively intangible. The educational benefits something might provide, the genetic resources that might provide, are other things that kind of get dropped into that cultural services bucket that you're probably currently reading about in the MEA system. And here's an example of that. This is what Earth Economics uses. It's very similar to the MEA. We've reclassified some things differently, but it's very similar. And the MEA pretty much takes this approach. They have this one service. We're able to measure a lot of these things up here, and along the side, especially regulatory services, we're very good at monetizing and measuring these sorts of things. But when you get into some of the ballpark informational services, this cultural category comes up, and oftentimes when you start talking about dollar value, this is pretty much scathed over and ignored. And it's like, we know this exists, but we really can't even place it on the map, let alone do any sort of quantification.
You mentioned MEA, and can you help me redefine the
Sure, that's the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and that's really they've released a lot. I guess that's an organization legitimately, and so they've released several publications that have kind of taken the lead effort and put in coining that term since during the turn of the century and even in the late 90s they've released a lot of documents putting this name out there and identifying the classification and finalizing it and making a standard.
Nora also mentioned it last week, and Scott uploaded onto Canvas the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment classification. It's under taxonomy, along with TEEB and the ecosystem services that we use.
Okay.
So it's all up there. Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll refer to MBA as just like the basic ecosystem service classification. That's kind of the first standardized system. And all the things that people have to say that's wrong